Beneath the towering bell of St. Jude's Church, where hymns once rose with the morning light, a storm brooded, not just in the skies but in the hearts of a town tested by prejudice and pride. One fateful Sunday, a boy's simple act of kindness was met with a cruel humiliation, setting the stage for a reckoning no one could have predicted. As thunder roared and lightning struck the sacred bell tower, it wasn't just the bricks and mortar that would be rebuilt. It was the fragile threads of community, faith, and forgiveness. What happened next would change everything. The stained glass windows of St. Jude's Church gleamed under the mid-morning sun, casting a mosaic of colors onto the wooden pews. The air inside was warm and thick with the scent of aged wood and incense. A hymn rose gently from the congregation, a tapestry of voices woven together in praise, carrying the hopeful energy of the people gathered there. In the third pew from the front, 12-year-old Samuel sat quietly beside his grandmother Martha. He fiddled with the edges of his pressed white shirt, glancing nervously at the program in his lap. Church services were a cornerstone of his Sundays, a mix of comfort and discipline. His grandmother, a woman of quiet strength and deep faith, had taught him to treat this place with the reverence it deserved. It was, as she often reminded him, the house of the Lord. But today, Samuel couldn't help but feel uneasy. His eyes wandered to the back of the church, where a tall, broad-shouldered white man in a police uniform leaned against the wall, Officer Miller. He wasn't a regular attendee. In fact, Samuel had only seen him in passing while walking to school, always with a sneer on his face or a glare that made him lower his eyes. Today, though, Miller was here, and his presence felt like a storm cloud hovering over a sunny field. The officer didn't bother hiding his disdain as he scanned the congregation, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He seemed out of place amid the joyful singing, his pose stiff and his expression unreadable but cold. "Don't pay him any mind," Martha whispered, noticing Samuel's lingering gaze. Her hand, worn from years of work but still steady, rested lightly on his shoulder. "We're here for God, not for men like him." Her words settled over him like a protective shield, but the tension in the room was undeniable. Whispers rippled through the congregation like an undercurrent beneath the hymns. People noticed Officer Miller, and they noticed his attitude. A few exchanged knowing glances, their faces tight with unease. The service continued, the choir's voices rising in a crescendo as the organ swelled. Reverend Jacobs, a tall, dignified man with a booming voice, stepped to the pulpit. His sermons were known for their wisdom and warmth, often weaving stories of resilience and faith. But just as Reverend Jacobs began his opening prayer, Samuel saw it happen. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a young girl from the choir accidentally nudge Officer Miller's arm with her hymnal as she passed. It was a small, harmless bump, barely worth acknowledging. Yet Miller's reaction was instant. His face twisted in irritation, and he muttered something under his breath, a sharp, cutting remark that Samuel couldn't quite make out but could feel. The girl froze, her eyes wide with fear, before scurrying away. The tension in the room thickened like a fog. Samuel swallowed hard, his palms damp as he clenched his program. "Stay focused, child," Martha said softly, sensing his unease. She opened her Bible, its leather cover cracked with age, and gestured for him to do the same. Her steady presence was a lifeline in the growing storm. As the service progressed, Samuel felt his nerves slowly settling. The choir's voices soothed his racing heart, and for a moment, he allowed himself to get lost in the rhythm of the prayers and hymns. But his reprieve was short-lived. When it came time for the collection plate to be passed around, Samuel eagerly volunteered to help. He wanted to show his grandmother he could be responsible, that he could contribute to the church community she loved so much. He approached the end of the pew where Officer Miller was seated. As Samuel extended the plate, he realized his mistake. The boy's hands trembled slightly, and the plate tilted just enough for a few coins to slide and clink against the polished floor. "Clumsy," Miller muttered loudly enough for those nearby to hear. His voice was laced with contempt. I'm sorry," Samuel stammered, quickly crouching to pick up the fallen coins. His ears burned with embarrassment. When he straightened, Miller's cold gaze locked onto him. For a moment, the officer leaned forward, his lips curling into a sneer. "Watch yourself, boy," Miller hissed, his tone low but venomous. The words hung in the air like a slap. Samuel froze, his heart pounding. The room felt suddenly quieter, the sounds of the congregation fading into the background. He glanced toward his grandmother, who was already rising from her seat. "Is there a problem here, officer?" Martha asked, her voice calm but firm. Her presence was commanding despite her small frame, and the officer hesitated before leaning back into the pew with a dismissive shrug. "Just teaching some manners," Miller said, his tone dripping with false innocence. He waved a hand as if the incident were beneath him. No harm done, but there was harm, and everyone in the surrounding pews could feel it. The congregation exchanged uneasy glances, their whispered prayers now tinged with tension. Reverend Jacobs looked over from the pulpit, his brow furrowed in quiet concern. "Come, Samuel," Martha said, guiding him back to their seat. Her voice was steady, but her grip on his arm was firm. She said nothing further, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes, a silent command to stay strong and not let him see him falter. As Samuel sat beside her, his hands still trembling slightly, he felt a mix of shame and anger bubbling inside him. He didn't understand why Miller treated him that way, why someone could carry so much hate into a place meant for peace. The hymn resumed, but the harmony of the congregation had been disrupted. The storm outside hadn't begun yet, but Samuel could feel it brewing, both in the sky and in the hearts of those around him. The congregation murmured in low voices as the service came to an end, the earlier tension still palpable. The faint hum of chatter mixed with the creaking of wooden pews as people began to stand and stretch. But Samuel sat quietly beside Martha, staring down at his polished black shoes. The words Officer Miller had spat at him replayed in his mind, each syllable sharp as glass. "Come, Samuel," Martha said softly, resting a hand on his shoulder. She nodded towards the church entrance, where tables had been set up for the weekly food drive. "Let's help with the donations." He nodded but didn't meet her eyes. Instead, he focused on the way her hand felt, strong but tender. It gave him just enough courage to rise from the pew and follow her. At the front of the church, volunteers bustled around, stacking bags of canned goods and sorting clothing donations. Samuel found a small box of non-perishables and lifted it, grateful for something to distract him. He carried the box towards the tables set up by the entrance, carefully weaving between clusters of people. As he neared the door, Officer Miller appeared, his hulking figure blocking the way. The officer had shed his earlier pretense of indifference, and now his expression was openly disdainful. His eyes scanned Samuel like a predator sizing up its prey. "Still underfoot, huh?" Miller sneered, stepping forward just enough to make Samuel halt in his tracks. The box in his hands suddenly felt heavier. Samuel froze. The man's tone was sharp, filled with mockery, but it was his eyes, hard, cold, and devoid of kindness, that made the boy's stomach twist. He tried to step around Miller, but the officer moved deliberately to block his path again. "Didn't I tell you to watch yourself?" Miller said, his voice low but menacing. His words carried a venom that burned hotter than the summer sun outside. Martha's voice suddenly cut through the thick tension like a blade. "Let the boy pass, officer." Miller turned his head slowly, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Teaching him to mouth off, too. I see," he said, his tone dripping with mock amusement. "You people never learn." The phrase made the air seem to thicken. Conversations around the entrance halted as several church members turned to watch the exchange. Reverend Jacobs stepped forward from the center aisle, his robe flowing behind him like a mantle of justice. "Officer Miller," the Reverend said, his voice calm but commanding, "this is a house of God, a sanctuary for all. Perhaps you should reconsider your tone." For a moment, Miller said nothing, his smirk fading into a cold glare. He looked between Martha and Samuel, then back to the Reverend. "I'll speak however I want," he snapped. "Respect's a two-way street." The Reverend didn't flinch. Respect is earned, not demanded through intimidation. The room fell silent, a tension so thick it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The congregation stood frozen, their eyes bouncing between the towering officer and the dignified Reverend. Samuel, still clutching the box of donations, tried to edge away from Miller, but the officer noticed. Without warning, Miller spat, a sharp, wet sound that seemed to echo in the silence. The glob of saliva landed on Samuel's arm, slick and vile. Gasps erupted from the congregation. Several women covered their mouths in shock, while others took a step forward, their outrage visible in their faces. Samuel's eyes widened in disbelief as he looked down at the stain on his skin. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he felt paralyzed. Enough, Martha's voice rang out, sharp and fierce. She moved quickly to her grandson, pulling him close and shielding him with her small frame. Her eyes, usually kind and patient, blazed with fury as she stared up at Miller. "How dare you?" she said, her voice trembling with controlled rage. "You disgrace yourself, your badge, and the uniform you wear." Miller laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Spare me the sermon, lady," he said, stepping back and crossing his arms. "The kid needs to toughen up. You're coddling him." The Reverend stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Martha's shoulder. "Officer Miller," he said firmly, "leave now, before you dig yourself an even deeper hole." Miller opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, a sudden crack of thunder reverberated through the air. The sound was so loud it rattled the windows, silencing the room. Everyone turned toward the stained glass windows, which now flickered with the eerie light of an approaching storm. Then, in an instant, the room was illuminated by a blinding flash of lightning. The bolt struck the church's bell tower, sending a deafening boom through the air. Shards of the bell's metal casing clattered to the ground outside, and a fine layer of dust rained down from the ceiling. Screams and gasps filled the room as the congregation scrambled for safety. The lights flickered, and a strange, almost electric hum seemed to buzz through the air. Miller stumbled backward, his bravado suddenly replaced by a flicker of fear. He glanced around, his face pale, as he tried to shake off the uneasy feeling washing over him. "Everyone stay calm," Reverend Jacobs called out, his voice steady despite the chaos. "It's just a storm. Stay together." But Samuel, still clutching his grandmother's hand, felt something deeper than fear. He couldn't explain it, but the storm didn't feel random. It felt purposeful, like the earth itself was responding to the injustice he just endured. As the storm raged outside, the congregation began to regroup, their fear giving way to quiet resilience. But Miller remained near the door, his shoulders hunched and his eyes darting nervously towards the darkened sky. "Divine retribution," Martha murmured under her breath, squeezing Samuel's hand. "You don't treat people like that in God's house and expect no consequence." Miller's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. For the first time that day, the officer looked genuinely unsure of himself. And for Samuel, a small ember of hope flickered in his chest, hope that justice, in some form, might finally be coming. The storm outside intensified, the wind howling like an anguished cry as it lashed against the church's heavy oak doors. Inside, the congregation huddled together, their whispered prayers rising in harmony with the roar of the thunder. Candles flickered wildly on the altar as the room seemed to pulse with a strange, almost sacred energy. Officer Miller stood near the doorway, his back pressed against the wall. His confidence, which had seemed unshakable mere moments ago, was now unraveling. His lips pressed into a thin line as he looked toward the bell tower, its structure now darkened and fractured from the lightning strike. Debris from the tower's shattered roof lay scattered across the courtyard, visible through the arched windows. Samuel remained close to his grandmother, her arm wrapped protectively around his shoulders. The boy was silent, his thoughts a chaotic whirl of anger, humiliation, and a faint but growing sense of vindication. He glanced up at her face, lined with years of wisdom and hardship. Her expression was calm, but her eyes burned with an unspoken fire. "Are you okay, Grandma?" Samuel asked softly. "I am, child," she replied, her voice steady. "But this is not over." Reverend Jacobs approached them, his robe fluttering slightly in the draft. "Sister Martha," he said, his deep voice laced with concern, "are you and the boy unharmed?" "We are," Martha replied. She glanced over at Miller, her gaze unwavering. "But there are wounds here that aren't visible." The Reverend nodded solemnly. "Justice will come," he said. "It always does, in time." Miller overheard the exchange and sneered. "Justice? Is that what you call a storm? Weather doesn't take sides, Reverend." Reverend Jacobs turned to face him, his towering presence suddenly imposing. "You may dismiss it as mere weather, officer, but I've lived long enough to know when something greater is at work. The question is, do you?" The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and unyielding. Miller shifted uncomfortably, the sneer slipping from his face. He turned away, muttering under his breath, and strode toward the door. "Where are you going?" Reverend Jacobs called after him. "Leaving," Miller snapped, yanking at the handle of the door. "I've had enough of your sermons and superstitions." The storm outside roared louder as he opened the door, the wind tearing at his uniform and sending papers flying. He took a step outside, only to pause when he saw his patrol car. The vehicle sat idle under the heavy rain, but something about it seemed off. He moved closer, squinting through the downpour. The windshield was cracked, an odd spiderweb pattern that hadn't been there before. Worse, the tires had flattened, as if punctured by an unseen force. He cursed under his breath, glancing back toward the church. "Serves him right," Samuel muttered, watching from the window. He felt Martha's hand on his shoulder, firm but gentle. "We don't celebrate another's suffering, child," she said, "even when they've wronged us. That's not our way." "But I know what he did," she interrupted, her tone softening. "But karma doesn't need our help. It works on its own." Miller's frustration grew as he inspected his useless car. He pulled out his radio, only to find it dead. No static, no signal, just an empty void of silence. He banged the device against his palm in frustration, but it refused to work. "Need some help, officer?" a voice called out. Miller spun around to see Reverend Jacobs standing in the doorway, his face calm but unreadable. The storm seemed to recede slightly, as if acknowledging the Reverend's presence. Miller shook his head. "I don't need anything from you or your people." Reverend Jacobs stepped forward, undeterred. "It seems you're having a bit of trouble. Your car, your radio, all useless in this storm. Perhaps you should come back inside." The officer scoffed. "I don't need your charity." "Charity isn't what I'm offering," Reverend Jacobs replied, his voice steady. "What I'm offering is sanctuary." Miller hesitated. The storm surged again, lightning streaking across the sky in jagged lines. The sound of thunder reverberated in his chest, almost like a warning. For the first time in years, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. Doubt about his choices, his actions, and the way he'd carried himself in the world. Reluctantly, he followed the Reverend back inside. Inside, the congregation had begun cleaning up the scattered debris and comforting one another. The atmosphere was tense but resolute, the unity of the people shining brighter than the storm outside. Miller watched them wearily, his earlier bravado stripped away. He found himself drawn to the sight of Samuel and Martha, the boy quietly helping his grandmother arrange the donation boxes that had been knocked over. Their quiet resilience unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. "You've made quite a mess of things, haven't you?" Martha said suddenly, her voice directed at Miller without looking up. Miller stiffened. "Excuse me. You came into this church with hate in your heart," she continued, her hands steady as she stacked cans. "You disrupted a sanctuary of peace, disrespected its people, and humiliated a child. And now, it seems the storm is speaking louder than any of us ever could." Miller opened his mouth to retort, but found no words. The room seemed to close in around him, the weight of Martha's words pressing down like an unrelenting tide. Reverend Jacobs approached and placed a hand on Miller's shoulder. "The storm will pass, officer. But the question is, what kind of man will you be when it does?" The officer stared at him, the weight of the moment sinking into his chest. For the first time, he felt small, smaller than the boy he'd spat on, smaller than the people he'd belittled. And for the first time, he wondered if he'd already gone too far to come back. Outside, the storm raged on, its fury echoing the inner turmoil of the man who had brought it to their doorstep. The storm continued its relentless assault outside, battering the church with sheets of rain and sharp gusts of wind. Inside, the air felt heavy, charged with an almost tangible energy. The congregation had settled into quiet groups, murmuring prayers and comforting one another. But every so often, their eyes drifted toward Officer Miller. He sat near the back of the church now, isolated and tense, his uniform damp from the rain and his jaw clenched tight. Samuel watched him from a distance, his chest still tight with the sting of humiliation. Though his grandmother's words echoed in his mind, "Karma doesn't need our help," he couldn't shake the anger that simmered within him. He clutched the edges of the donation table, his fingers pressing into the rough wood as he tried to steady himself. "Go take a break, child," Martha said softly, placing a warm hand on his shoulder. "I'll finish here." "But what if he—" Samuel started, glancing toward Miller. The man's shadowy figure seemed larger than life, even as he sat hunched and brooding. "He won't," Martha said firmly. "Not in this house." Her confidence was a fortress, and Samuel nodded reluctantly before stepping away. He moved toward the front of the church, where Reverend Jacobs was lighting candles at the altar. The flickering flames danced in the dim light, their glow offering a fragile sense of peace amid the storm. "Reverend," Samuel whispered, his voice hesitant. The tall man turned, his expression softening when he saw the boy. "Yes, Samuel? Why? Why did God let him do that to me?" The question came out in a rush, heavy with frustration and sadness. Why didn't he stop it? Reverend Jacobs crouched slightly, so his eyes were level with Samuel's. The Reverend's face, weathered and wise, held a sadness of its own. Sometimes, God lets things happen to teach us, and others, a lesson. It's not always easy to see in the moment, but there's a purpose. Samuel frowned, his young mind struggling to grasp the idea. It doesn't feel fair. No, it doesn't, Reverend Jacobs admitted. But fairness isn't always immediate. Sometimes it takes time for the scales to balance. And sometimes, God gives people like Officer Miller enough rope to hang themselves. The boy's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded, a small seed of understanding taking root. The Reverend rested a hand on his shoulder and said, "Stay strong, son. The storm isn't just outside, it's in here too. But it will pass." In the back of the church, Miller leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees and his hands clasped tightly together. The storm outside was fierce, but it wasn't the thunder or the lightning that unsettled him. It was the silence within. The murmurs of the congregation seemed distant, almost ghostly, and his thoughts raced uncontrollably. He remembered the moment he spat on the boy, the way the congregation had looked at him, the shame he'd refused to acknowledge. But now, in the dim light of the church, with the storm raging around him, he couldn't escape the weight of his actions. For years, he'd carried a sense of superiority, a belief that his badge gave him power over others. But tonight, that belief felt fragile, like a facade he could no longer sustain. The storm had shaken something loose inside him, something he couldn't yet name. He glanced at the door, considering whether to make a run for it, but the thought of stepping back into the storm made his stomach churn. Instead, he stood and began pacing, his boots echoing softly against the stone floor. "Restless, are we?" a voice said behind him. Martha stood a few feet away, her arms crossed over her chest. Her expression was calm but unyielding, her eyes sharp as they locked onto his. "Just thinking," Miller muttered, avoiding her gaze. "Good," she said simply. "You've got a lot to think about." Her words were like a mirror, reflecting his actions back at him with unflinching clarity. He wanted to argue, to tell her she didn't understand, but something about her presence stopped him. She was small, frail-looking even, but the strength she radiated was undeniable. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally, his voice low and tight. Martha stepped closer, her footsteps steady and deliberate. "It's not about what I want. It's about what's right. You wronged my grandson, humiliated him in front of his people, in God's house. That's not something you can brush off." He started, but she held up a hand. "Don't explain yourself to me, officer. Explain yourself to God. Explain yourself to that boy." Her voice was steady, her words cutting through the silence like a blade. "And pray he forgives you, because you'll find no peace until you do." Miller stood frozen, her words sinking deep into his chest. He wanted to push back, to defend himself, but the weight of her gaze made it impossible. Instead, he nodded stiffly and sat back down, his head bowing slightly. As the storm began to subside, the congregation gathered for a final prayer. The thunder had softened to a distant rumble, and the rain fell in steady but gentler sheets. The air inside the church was still heavy, but it carried a sense of release, as if the tension had finally begun to unravel. Samuel sat beside his grandmother, his small hand resting in hers. He felt lighter now, though the memory of the incident still lingered. Across the room, he saw Miller, his head bowed, his expression unreadable. For the first time, Samuel saw something in the officer's face that resembled regret. As Reverend Jacobs led the final prayer, his voice resonating through the room, Samuel closed his eyes. He didn't pray for revenge or punishment. Instead, he prayed for strength, for himself, for his grandmother, and even, reluctantly, for Miller. Because as his grandmother had taught him, that was the kind of man he wanted to be. Outside, the storm faded into the distance, leaving behind a quiet stillness. Inside, the seeds of change had been planted, and though it would take time, the scales of justice had already begun to tip. The morning sun broke through the remnants of the storm clouds, casting long rays of light across the damp earth. St. Jude's Church stood resilient, its bell tower damaged but still standing, a testament to its strength and the faith of the people within. The air was fresh, carrying the faint scent of rain, but the church itself remained somber. The events of the night lingered in the minds of the congregation. Samuel walked slowly beside his grandmother as they helped clean the debris scattered in the churchyard. His young hands gripped a broom tightly, pushing away twigs and fallen leaves. Though the storm had passed, the weight of what had happened hadn't left him. He glanced toward the side of the building, where Officer Miller stood staring at his damaged patrol car with a deep frown. "Why is he still here?" Samuel muttered, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. "He doesn't care about us." "Care isn't something you demand, child," Martha said, picking up a broken branch. "It's something you show, even when it's not returned." Samuel began, but his grandmother cut him off with a gentle shake of her head. "There's a lesson for him in all this," she said. "But there's a lesson for you too." The boy frowned, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What lesson?" "To carry your hurt with grace," she replied. "Anger is an easy load to pick up, but it's a heavy one to carry." Samuel didn't respond, but her words settled in his mind like seeds waiting to grow. Inside the church, Reverend Jacobs approached Miller, who stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight as he watched the volunteers work. The Reverend's footsteps were calm, deliberate, echoing softly on the stone floor. "You're still here," Reverend Jacobs said, his voice neutral. Miller's eyes flicked to him briefly before returning to the scene outside. "Car's still dead," he muttered. "Can't leave." The Reverend folded his hands in front of him, his gaze steady. "Perhaps it's not the car that's keeping you here." Miller stiffened but didn't reply. "Do you understand what happened last night?" Reverend Jacobs continued, his tone gentle but firm. "The storm, the lightning. Do you think it was random?" Miller turned to face him fully, his frustration bubbling over. "You think God sent a storm just because of me?" he snapped. "You think I'm that important?" The Reverend's expression didn't waver. "I think storms have a way of clearing the air, of forcing us to confront what we've buried. Whether you're ready to face it is up to you." For a moment, Miller said nothing, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Finally, he let out a bitter laugh. "What am I supposed to do? Apologize? Beg for forgiveness? You think that's going to fix anything?" "It's not about fixing," Reverend Jacobs replied. "It's about acknowledging. The boy, his grandmother, this community, they deserve that much from you." The afternoon sun climbed higher, drying the earth and warming the air. The congregation gathered once more, this time to rededicate themselves to rebuilding the damaged bell tower. Though the scars of the storm were visible, so too was the resilience of the people. Their voices carried over the breeze as they sang hymns, their harmony a testament to their unity. Samuel stood near the front steps, holding a small trowel as he helped replant flowers in the garden. His hands were covered in dirt, but he didn't mind. It felt good to create something new after all that had been destroyed. As he worked, he heard footsteps approaching. Looking up, he froze. Officer Miller stood a few feet away, his posture rigid, his face unreadable. Miller began, his voice rough. He cleared his throat, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "I wanted to talk." Samuel glanced at his grandmother, who stood nearby. She gave a small nod, her expression calm but watchful. Miller crouched slightly, so he was at eye level with the boy. His eyes softened, losing some of the harshness they'd carried the night before. "What I did, it wasn't right," he said. The words came slowly, as if each one was a weight he had to lift. "I disrespected you, your family, your church. I was wrong." The boy stared at him, unsure of what to say. Part of him wanted to yell, to tell Miller how much he hated him, but another part, the part shaped by his grandmother's teachings, kept him quiet. Miller sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, "but I wanted you to know. I'm sorry." For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The congregation's singing faded into the background, and the only sound was the rustle of the wind through the trees. Finally, Samuel nodded. "Okay," he said softly. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. Miller nodded, his shoulders sagging slightly in relief. "Thank you," he said, standing and stepping back. As he turned to leave, Martha called after him. "Officer." He stopped, looking back at her. She stepped closer, her eyes sharp as they met his. "An apology is just words. What matters is what you do next." Miller nodded again, her words striking deeper than he cared to admit. Without another word, he walked toward the parking lot, the sunlight casting long shadows on the ground. That evening, as the congregation gathered for one final prayer, the repaired bell rang out across the town. Its sound was clear and strong, cutting through the quiet night like a beacon of hope. Samuel stood with his grandmother, the weight of the past day finally lifting from his shoulders. As he listened to the bells toll, he felt a sense of peace, a knowledge that while the storm had tested them, it had also strengthened them. And as the sound echoed into the distance, he glanced up at the sky, the stars shining brightly against the dark. The storm was gone, but its lessons remained etched into the hearts of those who had weathered it. The following days brought a calm that the congregation at St. Jude's hadn't felt in some time. The skies remained clear, the air lighter, as if the storm had swept away more than just debris. Yet beneath the calm exterior, echoes of the night's events lingered, shaping the conversations and quiet reflections of those who had been there. Samuel walked through the churchyard, now tidied and refreshed, with a watering can in hand. The flowers he'd helped replant were standing tall, their vibrant colors a reminder of renewal and resilience. As he poured water over the buds and petals, he felt a small sense of pride. It wasn't much, but it was something, a contribution to the healing of a space that had always been a sanctuary for him. "Looks good, doesn't it?" Martha's voice drifted over his shoulder. He turned to see her standing a few feet away, her hands folded over a worn Bible. She was watching him with that familiar mixture of warmth and wisdom that always made him feel safe. "Yeah," Samuel said softly, setting the watering can down. "It feels better now." She smiled, nodding. "Healing takes time, child, but it always comes." Inside the church, Reverend Jacobs was meeting with Officer Miller. The officer sat stiffly in one of the pews, his uniform replaced with civilian clothes, a subtle acknowledgement of his changed demeanor. The Reverend, ever composed, sat beside him, his hands resting lightly on the polished wood. "You've taken the first step," Reverend Jacobs said, his voice calm. "Acknowledging what you did and apologizing. Those aren't small things." Miller shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the floor. "It doesn't feel like enough." "Because it isn't," the Reverend replied evenly. "Words are important, but they're only the beginning. What comes next is action. How you live from this moment forward is what will define you." Miller nodded slowly, the weight of the words sinking in. "I don't know how to fix what I've done." "You start by listening," Reverend Jacobs said. "To the people you've hurt, to the community you've ignored, and to the part of yourself that knows what's right. You're not here to be comfortable, officer. You're here to change." The words struck Miller like a hand. He'd spent his career believing his badge gave him authority, power, and the right to control situations. But now, stripped of that facade, he realized how hollow that belief had been. He looked up at the Reverend, his expression one of uncertainty mixed with resolve. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. The Reverend smiled faintly. "You rebuild, just like this church, one brick at a time." Later that afternoon, Miller found himself back in the churchyard. The congregation was gathered for a community meal, tables laden with homemade dishes and pitchers of sweet tea. Laughter and conversation filled the air, a stark contrast to the tension that had gripped the church days before. Miller hesitated at the edge of the gathering, unsure if he belonged. He had offered to stay and help, but now that he was here, he felt like an intruder in a space he had disrupted so deeply. "Officer Miller," a voice called. He turned to see Martha approaching, her gait steady despite her age. In her hands was a plate piled high with food. She handed it to him without a word, her eyes meeting his with a gaze that was both stern and understanding. "You're here," she said simply. "That's a start." Miller took the plate, unsure of what to say. He followed her to one of the tables, where she motioned for him to sit. Around them, conversations quieted briefly as people noticed his presence, their expressions ranging from curiosity to weariness. Samuel, seated a few spots away, watched the scene unfold. He still felt a pang of anger when he saw Miller, but his grandmother's words echoed in his mind. "Karma doesn't need our help." Slowly, he pushed his plate toward the center of the table, a silent gesture of offering. Miller noticed and nodded, a faint but genuine gratitude in his eyes. As the meal continued, the atmosphere softened. Stories were shared, laughter grew, and the barriers between Miller and the community began to blur. He listened more than he spoke, absorbing the experiences and wisdom of those around him. It was humbling, but it was also a lesson he knew he needed. Near the end of the meal, Reverend Jacobs stood to address the group. His voice carried easily over the crowd, commanding attention without demanding it. "This church has seen storms, both outside and within," he began, his gaze sweeping over the congregation. "But what matters is how we respond. Do we let the storm destroy us, or do we rebuild stronger? He paused, his eyes landing on Miller. Officer Miller has taken steps toward rebuilding. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick. But as a community, we are called to guide those who seek redemption, not by excusing their actions, but by showing them a better way. The congregation murmured in agreement, their expressions thoughtful. Miller, though uncomfortable, felt the flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. As the evening drew to a close, Samuel found himself standing near the repaired bell tower. He ran his fingers along the smooth wood of the new bell rope, its texture a reminder of resilience and renewal. Miller approached hesitantly, his steps slow and deliberate. "Hey," he said, his voice softer than Samuel had ever heard it. The boy turned, his gaze cautious. "Hey, I wanted to thank you," Miller said, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. For letting me try to make this right." Samuel studied him for a long moment before nodding. "You're welcome." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. And as the two stood there, the bell above them rang out, its clear, resonant tone echoing across the town. The sound carried with it a promise that healing was possible, and that even the most broken pieces could be made whole again. The bell's toll echoed across the quiet town, lingering in the air like a hymn carried by the wind. Its sound reached beyond the churchyard, weaving through the streets and into the hearts of those who had heard the stories of what happened that stormy night. For those gathered at St. Jude's, the bell's chime was more than a sound. It was a symbol, a declaration of resilience, unity, and hope. Samuel watched the bell sway gently after its final strike, its movement slow and deliberate, like the beating of a heart. He stood by the base of the tower, leaning against the cool stone as the evening breeze brushed against his face. The faint laughter and conversations from the congregation's gathering floated toward him, but he found solace in this quiet corner, away from the hum of voices. The crunch of footsteps on gravel pulled him from his thoughts. Turning, he saw Miller approaching, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. The officer's posture was less rigid now, his shoulders no longer squared in defiance, but instead hunched with a kind of vulnerability that made him seem smaller. "Mind if I join you?" Miller asked, his voice cautious. Samuel hesitated, then shrugged. "It's a free yard." The officer chuckled softly, though it was clear he wasn't at ease. He stood a few feet away, his eyes fixed on the bell tower. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching like a thread between them. "That's a good sound," Miller said finally, nodding toward the bell. "Feels steady, like it's been here forever." "It has," Samuel replied, his tone guarded. "Longer than you." The words weren't meant to be cruel, but they stung nonetheless. Miller nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Yeah," he said softly. "Longer than me." Another pause. The wind rustled the leaves of the nearby trees, filling the space between them. Miller glanced at Samuel, his expression unreadable. "You know," he began, "when I was your age, I used to spend a lot of time in places like this. My mom was big on church. She said it was the only place where she felt like she could really breathe." Samuel turned to look at him, surprised by the admission. "She used to say that the church was for everyone," Miller continued. "Didn't matter what you'd done or where you came from. It was a place to start over." He let out a bitter laugh. "Guess I forgot that somewhere along the way." Samuel didn't respond immediately. He studied the officer, noting the way his eyes seemed to carry a weight that wasn't there before. Finally, he spoke. "Why did you do it?" The question was simple, but it carried the force of all the hurt and confusion Samuel had felt since that night. It hung in the air, heavy and demanding. Miller exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cooling evening air. "Because I thought I could," he admitted. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but the honesty in it was unmistakable. "I thought my badge gave me the right to look down on people, to judge them without knowing them. I thought it made me better." He shook his head, his gaze dropping to the ground. "But it didn't. All it did was make me smaller." Samuel stared at him, his chest tightening. The anger he'd carried for days flared briefly, but it was tempered by something else, something his grandmother had planted in him, like a seed waiting for the right moment to grow. "You're right," Samuel said finally, his voice steady. "It doesn't make you better." Miller nodded, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I know,